Speaker, I am rising to support the Limitation of Actions Child Sexual Abuse Amendment Bill 2018, which amends the Limitation of Actions Act 1936 and abolishes the limitation period for claims for compensation by victims of child sexual abuse. I support this bill because the truth must come out and the social and personal impacts of child sexual abuse must be recognised and acknowledged and compensated. When humans are young, their world revolves around their parents or their primary caregivers. Parents or caregivers are the primary source of safety, security, love, understanding, nurturance and support. Child abuse violates the trust at the core of a child's relationship with the world. When the primary relationship is one of betrayal, a negative schema or set of belief develops. This negative core schema often affects an individual's capacity to establish and sustain significant attachment throughout their life. Again, as I said in my maiden speech, I apologise that this topic makes you feel uncomfortable, and I understand that because this criminal activity can make a child feel uncomfortable for their lifetime. I would like to share an excerpt from a survivor, Corin Lynch, who has shared a poem on the Blue Knot Foundation website. He warned me to be silent or else I would die. Was that the day a young child lost the ability to cry? The threat was real. My child's mind imagined death, as in silence I cowered, trying to catch my breath. But my innocence was stolen by more than one man. Now, nearly half a century later, I think it's time I took a stand. Because for all that time, I've lived with the shame and the disgust, built a wall around me because I felt there was no one I could trust. Let's be clear, what I'm talking about is not bad parenting or creepy people. We are talking about a criminal activity impacting too many children in our community. This bill addresses observations made in the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, Redress and Civil Litigation report released in September 2015. The Royal Commission found that the existence of a limitation period creates significant barriers for survivors of child sexual abuse and operates unreasonably to deny victims access to justice. The Limitation of Actions Act 1936 currently sets a limitation period of 3 years for bringing a common law action in personal injury. For a person who suffered abuse as a child, this means that an action must be commenced by his or her 21st birthday. Mr. Speaker, this imperative piece of legislation takes into account all victims of child sexual abuse, not just those who have fallen victim to the predatory behaviour in government and non-government institutions. The Royal Commission into Child Abuse uncovered a culture of abuse, cover-up and complacency. It helped expose pedophiles and led real change, and Malcolm Turnbull, our Prime Minister, deserves great credit for his government's response. A national redress scheme for victims has now been agreed, laws have been changed in response to recommendations, and victims finally have access to justice. Mr. Speaker, I am proud and grateful that this new Marshall Liberal government announced in May 2018 that South Australia will join the National Redress Scheme to provide financial and therapeutic support for people who were sexually abused as children in government institutions. Joining the National Redress Scheme is an important step in the state government taking responsibility for and helping to heal the pain caused by the sexual abuse of children in government institutions. I agree with the Premier Stephen Marshall's comments on this decision. Nothing can undo the inexcusable abuse that survivors experienced as children, but we can acknowledge what they have been through and provide financial compensation and emotional support. Today, this bill asks for us to show understanding, care and compassion for every victim of child sexual abuse. I ask that we reflect again on the unacceptable rates of child sexual abuse in Australia. The statistics are estimated to be 1 in 5 children victims of child sexual abuse. Let's for a moment picture in our minds, looking in to a typical local Year 4 classroom, 27 children sitting on the mat in front of their teacher. Statistics suggest 5 of these innocent children are being sexually abused, most by someone they know and they trust. When I'm at school assemblies, I look into the children for the sad faces, and I'm always thinking that I want to make the world safer for each of these children. In 70 to 80% of child sexual abuse cases, there is a familial family relationship between the victim and the offender. In other words, the offender is most often the father, the stepfather, the uncle, the neighbour or the family friend. Although parents often fear that strangers will abuse their children, it has been well documented that most child sex offenders are known to their victims. Just last week, parents in my electorate were alarmed that strangers threatened the safety of children in our streets, and it caused much discussion online. I was worried for my community too. However, I'm deeply concerned every day knowing the abuse of children by people they know and trust is happening in our neighbourhoods. The Royal Commission made important recommendations that we must fix the variation of policies and laws in Australia to better protect children's rights. It called for nationally consistent laws to protect children, their best interests and their rights. The Liberal Party in opposition previously introduced this bill in 2016, following the Nyland Royal Commission. This bill, under the previous government, was never debated and had no support from the Labor Party. I am proud that this new caring, people-focused state government are acting swiftly to put victims first and ensure they have the appropriate mechanisms to seek justice and compensation for horrendous, unacceptable crimes committed against them. Last week in the paper, there was a report talking about the levels of mental health issues we are seeing in our community. And researchers argue that the state government would need to boost its clinical mental health budget by $100 million and grow the trained workforce by more than 950 community and mental health professionals to ensure children being impacted by these issues are receiving the best level of care. The research paints a disturbing picture of children's mental health in South Australia. Child abuse and neglect makes it very difficult for children to make sense of the world, and their brains don't fully develop. Dr. Siegel in this report said the consequences of children having poor mental health was dire and could lead to a cycle of damage and powerlessness, from school failure, self-harm, alcohol abuse, suicide or involvement in crime. She said the cycle of mental illness was also impacted by the fact that people who had experienced trauma during childhood had the tendency to replicate their parents' behaviour when they raised their own children. Every parent wants to do the best for their child, but often their own trauma or history gets in the way because children with a trauma history struggle to parent themselves, perpetuating this situation. It has been well documented that the sexual abuse of children has a range of very serious consequences for victims. Reports list depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, antisocial behaviours, suicidality, eating disorders, alcohol and drug misuse, postpartum depression, parenting difficulties, sexual re-victimisation and sexual dysfunction are some of the manifestations of child sexual abuse amongst victims. Survivors of child sexual abuse are 18 times more likely to take their own lives than the general population, and they are 49 times more likely to die from an accidental drug overdose. Furthermore, child sexual abuse has been found to be a key factor in youth homelessness, with between 50 and 70% of young people within supported accommodation assistance programs having experienced child sexual assault. A survivor of child sexual abuse recently wrote, "I tried suicide many times and failed. Now he is in custody awaiting sentencing. I am finally finding some peace." The abolishment of the limitation period is so important because there are just so many reasons victims may not speak up for a very long time, including they may not know what is happening to them is not normal, they may not have the knowledge or language to speak up, they might not have a safe person to speak up to, they might not be believed, they may have been threatened not to speak up, they fear the abuse will happen to their other siblings if they speak up, they might be simply too ashamed to speak up. One of my friends did not speak up until her 40s because she said she grew up in a country town and she thought if she ever told anyone in the town, she thought everyone would find out. As a young girl, she was raped every time her older brother's friends slept over. Two of my friends started having terrible dreams in their 40s and through counselling discovered they were victims of incest. They have told me how hard their families fought to deny and cover up the abuse and discredit these individuals who speak up. Victims may never feel the courage or motivation to come forward against a perpetrator, let alone at the young age of 21. As I shared in my maiden speech, I met adult survivors of child sexual abuse who told me their stories, and none of them had personally prosecuted their perpetrators. For the survivors brave enough to speak up, to take action, to hold their abuser accountable and seek compensation, I ask everyone here for your support for them. In the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses to Child Sexual Abuse, it was found that very often a person who is the subject of abuse as a child does not disclose or even recognise the significance of the abuse until they are well into their adulthood. Sadly, what can happen, particularly in circumstances of child sexual abuse, is that the memory and recall can be suppressed or not really dealt with or acknowledged. There are just so many reasons why children keep this secret to themselves. We know that is not the right thing to happen. We know that the abuse should not occur in the first place. We know that they should feel free and comfortable to be able to tell someone, and we know they should have relief and protection. In South Australia, we can give children a voice earlier to help them have a healthier future. I am proud that South Australia has an internationally recognised Keeping Safe Child Protection curriculum, a curriculum which reflects contemporary child safety topics such as cyber safety, problematic sexual behaviour, domestic violence and gender equality. This curriculum is available for teachers and early childhood staff and other educators to help children and young people in an age-appropriate way to recognise abuse and tell a trusted adult and learn strategies to keep themselves safe. This curriculum was first delivered in 2008, and it is my understanding that it is mandated across South Australia. I have seen firsthand this curriculum effectively embedded and being taught at the Golden Grove Primary School, headed by an outstanding principal, Wendy Moore. Sadly, I'm not convinced it is embedded effectively across our state, but I'm going to seek support of our colleagues to explore this opportunity further. And I've discussed this implementation with the Minister for Education because I've been asking for many years now whether we are teaching it effectively, if there is evidence of compliance, and alarmingly, I've not received answers that give me confidence in the effective implementation. But it is a great opportunity to help kids speak up earlier. The child protection curriculum strengthens the likelihood of children and young people speaking out to protect themselves and others, and helps us break the cycle of abuse that we have today. Another key issue today is that a very small percentage of child sexual offenders are convicted. That means that when we screen community members to identify who is safe to work or volunteer with our children, we are omitting so many offenders in this screening process. Low sentencing rates put our children at constant risk. Child sexual abuse is a social problem with huge social and economic costs. It is not just an issue of the past, because it casts a shadow on people's lives which affect adult life and can affect the children of victims as well. The truth must come out and offenders must be held accountable if we are to break this cycle of abuse. I wish today to acknowledge the daily work of child protection advocates across Australia who seek to create awareness and lobby for change and a safer community. A special mention to Christina's House of Hope, Safe for Kids, Some Secrets Should Never Be Kept, Brave Hearts and Fighters Against Child Abuse Australia for all the work they do every day. I congratulate my Liberal colleagues because this is a commitment our previous Liberal opposition made to South Australia. We committed to introducing legislation to remove the limitation period for victims of institutional child sexual abuse within the first 100 days in government, and this is what we're doing. This bill achieves this result, but applies to all victims of child sexual abuse, not just those who suffered abuse in institutional setting, as I've previously mentioned. As recognised by the Royal Commission into Institutional Responses, it is critical that survivors have the opportunity to come forward into adulthood and seek some redress where appropriate. This is a right that should not be denied to them. I commend the Attorney-General for her recent comments. This government, in stark contrast to the former, is implementing decisive change, and we are proud to do so. We want to ensure that victims do not need to beg to the court to hear their story when they're ready to tell. Brave survivors who speak up deserve a bold government to make laws which hold offenders accountable. If not us, then who? If not now, then when? Let's be the bold government that child victims and adult survivors need. Let's break the cycles of abuse and create cycles of opportunity. The Limitation of Actions Amendment Bill is an important step towards addressing decades of injustice and indifference shown to victims, both institutional and otherwise. Put simply, Mr. Speaker, I support this bill because the truth must come out and survivors must be supported so they can live their best life possible. Mr. Speaker, I congratulate the Attorney-General for presenting this bill, and I commend the bill to members.
Member for Badcote.
Thank you.